Okay, so we're looking today at Chapter 4, and we're looking specifically at the federal system. Now, the federal system, if you'll recall, is our governmental system in which we divide power up between the individual small states and then the larger national government, which is located here in Washington, D.C. So the definition of federalism basically states that this is a political system which binds a group of states into a larger, non-centralized, superior state. Remember, when we talk about state at this point, that we are speaking rather specifically about the United States, not each individual state, not Michigan, not Wisconsin. There are characteristics and principles common to all successful federal systems. They all have a written constitution, and in our country, all individual states have a written constitution. And those are the laws which stipulate the distribution of power, the diffusion of power among the other elements within, that they are self-sustaining, that there are also territorial divisions which help to ensure neutrality. Okay, and any change to that system or that constitution essentially requires the consent or acknowledgement of the people within that country. And we've got some really great modern systems. The United States, Brazil, and quite frankly, Germany and Nigeria have come a long way. Now, no matter what you're dealing with, there's power to be divided. So within the federal system, we have this great Venn diagram here, and we have the specific powers here that belong only to the federal government, and the powers here that belong only to the states. And then these powers here are shared. So the federal government is the only government that can declare war. That has to come out of Washington, D.C. They're also the only ones that can create and maintain an armed force. And by that, we mean Navy, Army, Marines. The National Guard actually falls under provide for public safety for the state. And that's why we have individual state National Guards, which can be called up by the federal government. Establishing foreign policy, Michigan doesn't make its own arrangements with Canada. Regulation of interstate and foreign trade. Make copyright and patent laws, the establishment of post offices, and the coining of money. Now, at one point, all states coined their own money, and then the actual printing of paper money continued to go on for several years after this was put into place. Right up into the Civil War, individual communities made their own money. But afterwards, we ended up with a more defined concept of how the money would work. And really today, we know that all of our money is produced in Washington, D.C. Now, powers reserved by the states. The individual states get to establish their local governments. And so here in Michigan, we have counties. In New York, they have boroughs. In Louisiana, they have parishes. And this is an example of how those governments are similar and yet a little bit different. They get to establish and maintain the schools. Also really important. In our Michigan Constitution, it actually delineates that local school boards will go ahead and maintain and establish those schools and determine what's taught and what isn't taught. Regulating trade within the state. So Richmond can determine where it's going to sell its grain and how much it'll charge, say, to Kalamazoo, but not to Ohio, because that would be interesting. Conducting elections, and then providing for public safety. So that's, again, where you saw your National Guard. The conduction of elections, that would be when the election day happens. And, we saw just recently that we had early elections and absentee balloting and all sorts of things like that. And that's determined individually by each state. Now, both state and federal government can raise taxes. They both get to provide for the public welfare. So we both have entitlement programs. We both have welfare programs, individual, like state and federal, unemployment. Okay, criminal justice, you know that we've got state and federal courts, and you know that certain things are a crime on the federal level that might not be a crime on the state level, or they both are, and then it's shared. Borrowing money, chartering of banks, and the building of roads, which again, sometimes you see that you're driving down M19, which is Michigan 19, but you then might get onto I-94, which is Interstate 94, which is run by the federal government. Now, what are the national powers? Okay, you have the delegated powers. Those are the very, very clear powers. It says these are the federal powers. These are given specifically to the federal government. Okay, expressed powers are all of the mentioned powers, expressed or enumerated powers. Okay, and those are very clearly listed powers. You can do this, you can do this, you can do this, but you may not do this. Implied powers are those things that are considered necessary and proper. It doesn't specifically say you can do it, but we feel that it would be necessary and proper for the running of the government. It's not listed, and that's where we get that elastic clause put in there. Inherent powers are those things that are automatically something that a government needs to do to function, like the determination of immigration, how that'll be dealt with. That's an inherent power. What are we going to do with a national power outage? Believe it or not, that would be an inherent power. Are we going to put martial law in place? That's an inherent power. It's something a government needs to be able to do simply to function. Anything that is necessary simply to function, that is what we call an inherent power. And those reserved powers are those powers that belong specifically to the state and no one else. Okay. The supremacy clause we talked a little bit about before. The supremacy clause says that if there is a federal law and a state law, and the state law contradicts the federal law, then the federal law wins. So again, we see the issue of Denver says that you can possess that ounce of pot, or not Denver anymore, it used to just be Denver. Now it's all of Colorado says you can own that ounce of pot. Okay, but the federal law still says that's illegal. So again, if you're arrested by a federal police officer, then you will be charged, whereas the state might not do anything about it. Okay. Denied powers, okay, are those things that are very, very, very specifically denied, okay? They are not allowed on either or on a specific level. So, and it says very clearly, like, Michigan cannot make a treaty with a foreign nation, okay? That's something that the federal government has to do. Specifically, it's something that Congress really has to do, okay? It's not something that can just be done. All right, so we're going to stop there. We'll come back. We're going to discuss concurrent powers in class. Be prepared with an example of what a concurrent power is.